Right now, while you watch this, over 1 billion people are on TikTok. They're watching cooking videos, dance challenges, political commentary, comedy skits, pet videos, outrage, beauty tutorials, breaking news filtered through a 22-second clip. They're scrolling and scrolling, and the algorithm, the most powerful content recommendation engine ever built, is watching them back, learning them, mapping the precise contours of what makes each specific human being pause, rewatch, engage. In the time it takes you to finish watching this scene, TikTok has collected data points from millions of users. What they watched, for how long, where they paused, what they skipped, their location, their device, their browsing patterns, their biometric information in some cases, faces, voices, the physical signature of how they hold a phone, all of it flowing in real time into servers whose ultimate ownership and ultimate accessibility is the question at the center of the most consequential technology dispute in the world right now. Because here's what governments from Washington to Brussels to Canberra to New Delhi want to know. Where does that data go? Who can access it? And is there a pipeline, invisible, deniable, technically obscured, running from the servers that store 1 billion people's most intimate behavioral data to the intelligence apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party? TikTok says no, emphatically, repeatedly, in congressional testimony, in legal filings, in lobbying documents, in public statements from executives who have spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to make the answer convincing. But here's the thing. In China, no from a private company doesn't necessarily mean what no means anywhere else. Because in China, there is a law passed in 2017, and what it says is the reason this story exists. This is TikTok versus governments, the story of the app that conquered the world, and the governments that decided they couldn't afford to let it stay. The story of data and power and the invisible infrastructure of the most consequential geopolitical battle of the digital age. Let's go. Before TikTok was TikTok, it was something called Douyin. And before Douyin, there was a man named Zhang Yiming and an insight about attention that would make him one of the wealthiest people on Earth and trigger a political firestorm that he almost certainly did not plan for. Zhang Yiming founded ByteDance in Beijing in 2012. He was 29 years old, a graduate of Nankai University with a software engineering background, and a specific obsession with a problem that every media company in the world was struggling with. How do you know what someone wants to see before they know they want to see it? The dominant content discovery model in 2012 was social. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, these platforms showed you content that your friends shared, content from creators you followed, content that human editors had determined was worth surfacing. The model was effective, but limited by a specific constraint. It could only serve you what people like you had already decided to share, filtered through the network of connections you'd explicitly built. It was reactive, not predictive. It showed you what was popular, not necessarily what was specifically right for you. Zhang saw a different architecture. What if, instead of building a social graph, a map of who follows whom, you built a behavioral graph? What if instead of asking, what are your friends like, you asked, what does this specific person's behavior, moment by moment, tell us about what will hold their attention for the next 15 seconds? The technology that ByteDance built to answer that question is what the tech industry calls a recommendation engine, but the word engine undersells it. It is better described as an attention optimization system, a machine learning model that processes enormous quantities of behavioral data and uses it to continuously refine its predictions about what content will produce maximum engagement from any given user. Every time you watch a video to the end, the system notes what type of content produced completion. Every time you scroll past something quickly, the system notes the disengagement. Every rewatch, every share, every comment, all of it feeds back into the model in real time. The result is an algorithm of extraordinary effectiveness. Research published by academics and independent technologists studying TikTok's recommendation system have consistently found that it achieves content personalization faster, often within 30 minutes of a new user's first session, than any other platform. The For You page, which is what TikTok calls the algorithmically curated feed that most users primarily experience, is designed to be so precisely calibrated to your specific interests that leaving it feels like a choice rather than the default. This is not accidental. It is the product of years of refinement on a system that was first deployed in China under the Douyin name, where it became the dominant short video platform with hundreds of millions of users, before ByteDance began considering international expansion. The effectiveness of the algorithm had been proven at massive scale in the most competitive consumer internet market in the world. What ByteDance was about to bring to the rest of the world was not a new app. It was a proven weapon for capturing and holding human attention. In 2018, ByteDance acquired Musical.ly, an American lip-sync video app that had built a user base of approximately 200 million, many of them teenagers in the United States and Europe, for approximately $1 billion, and merged it with Douyin's international version to create TikTok. The combination of Musical.ly's existing Western user base and TikTok's algorithm was immediately explosive. By 2019, TikTok was the most downloaded app in the world. By 2020, it had 1 billion monthly active users. By 2023, that number exceeded 1.5 billion. The speed of the growth was unlike anything the social media industry had seen. Facebook took 4 years to reach 100 million users. Instagram took 2.5 years. TikTok reached 1 billion in approximately 3 years from the Musical.ly merger. And unlike most platforms that build their initial user base in a specific demographic and then struggle to expand, TikTok was cross-generational. It had captured teenagers, yes, but also adults in their 30s and 40s and 50s, parents and professionals, politicians and celebrities, in every country where it was available. For the intelligence and security communities in Western governments, this growth curve was not cause for celebration. It was cause for a very specific kind of alarm. Because the faster TikTok grew, the more data it held. And the question of who ultimately controlled that data was not going away. June 28th, 2017. The Standing Committee of the National People's Congress of the People's Republic of China passes the National Intelligence Law. Article 7 of that law reads, in translation, "All organizations and citizens shall support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence work in accordance with law." 14 words in the English translation. 14 words that became the foundation of every national security concern about TikTok that any government has expressed since. Because what Article 7 means, in the context of a Chinese technology company operating globally, is this. If China's intelligence services ask ByteDance for data, ByteDance is legally required to provide it. ByteDance's response to this characterization has been consistent and legally careful. The company has stated that it has never received a request for user data from Chinese authorities and has never provided it, that its Chinese operations are separate from its international operations, and that the legal obligations created by Chinese law apply to activities within China and do not create an obligation to hand over data stored outside China. These arguments are reasonable legal positions. They are not, however, the kind of ironclad assurances that satisfy intelligence professionals, whose job is to worry about what can happen, not just what has happened. The concern is structural, not behavioral. The question is not whether ByteDance has handed data to the Chinese government so far. The question is whether it could, if ordered to, and whether, given the nature of the Chinese political and legal system, it would have any realistic choice but to comply. A Chinese technology company that received a national security letter equivalent from the Ministry of State Security and decided to resist it would face consequences that no American company would face for resisting a comparable American request. This structural vulnerability is what makes TikTok different from other data privacy concerns. Every major technology company in the world collects enormous quantities of user data. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, all of them hold behavioral profiles of billions of users that are, in certain hands, extraordinarily powerful tools. The difference is the legal and political framework within which those companies operate. An American company that receives a government request for user data has legal mechanisms available, including courts, lawyers, and the ability to publicize the request that provides some check on the government's power. A Chinese company operating under Article 7 has no equivalent check. Security officials in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and the European Union began raising this concern seriously around 2019 and 2020. The concerns were initially expressed through classified briefings and internal government memos, the kind of communication that stays within the walls of national security establishments and doesn't produce public headlines. The officials raising them were not politicians looking for a China issue to campaign on. They were intelligence analysts and cybersecurity professionals whose job was to identify exactly this type of structural vulnerability. What they were describing in those early briefings was not a scenario in which TikTok was actively collecting intelligence for the Chinese government today. They were describing a capability, a potential access path to the behavioral data of hundreds of millions of people in adversary nations. The data TikTok holds is not just personal. It is, at sufficient scale, strategic. If you can see what 1 million American government employees, military personnel, or critical infrastructure workers are watching, searching, engaging with, and being served by the algorithm, you have an intelligence picture of extraordinary depth. If you can influence what the algorithm shows to specific populations, not necessarily in crude propaganda ways, but in subtle content distribution patterns that shape what narratives get amplified and what ones get suppressed, you have something that no foreign intelligence service has ever had before. The concern wasn't paranoid. It was the kind of concern that security professionals are paid to have before something goes wrong, not after. And then evidence started emerging that made the concern less theoretical. October 2021. A lawsuit filed by a former TikTok content moderation employee reveals internal communications suggesting that ByteDance engineers in China had accessed the personal data of TikTok users in the United States without the consent of those users or the knowledge of TikTok's American security team. June 2022. BuzzFeed News publishes an investigation based on leaked audio from approximately 80 internal TikTok meetings. The recordings, made between 2019 and 2022, contain statements from TikTok and ByteDance employees that are, for a company that had been publicly stating for 3 years that Chinese employees could not access American user data, deeply uncomfortable. In one recording, a member of TikTok's Trust and Safety Department says, "Everything is seen in China." In another, a ByteDance engineer in China is described as a master admin with access to everything. Multiple recordings reference the fact that American employees had to request data access from their counterparts in China because the Chinese engineers were the ones with the relevant access permissions. These were not external allegations. These were internal voices, captured in company meetings, describing a data access architecture that was directly contradicted by what TikTok's executives had been telling Congress, regulators, and the public. TikTok's response was to acknowledge that some access to American user data by ByteDance employees had occurred, to describe the situation as a historical one that was being resolved through a project called Project Texas, an initiative to store American user data exclusively on servers owned and operated by Oracle, a US company, and to build a technical and organizational firewall between TikTok's American operations and ByteDance's Chinese ones. The company said the BuzzFeed recordings reflected a past state that the Project Texas initiative was specifically designed to address. But the damage to TikTok's narrative was significant. The company had spent years insisting that Chinese access to American user data was not happening and could not happen. The BuzzFeed recordings showed that it had been happening. Whether it was still happening after Project Texas was implemented was a question that TikTok's assurances alone could not answer to the satisfaction of security officials who had been watching the company say things that turned out to be inaccurate. The congressional reaction was swift. Senators and representatives from both parties, this was one of the few issues in contemporary American politics that generated genuine bipartisan alarm, began requesting briefings, holding hearings, and introducing legislation. The CEO of TikTok, Xiaozi Chu, was summoned to testify before the House Energy and Commerce Committee. What happened in that hearing room was 5 hours of something that simultaneously illuminated the genuine national security concerns and exposed the limits of congressional understanding of the technology at issue. The performance was extraordinary. in ways that helped almost nobody. March 23, 2023, the Rayburn House Office Building, Washington, D.C. Xiao Zhiqiu, TikTok's CEO, a 40-year-old Singaporean with a Harvard MBA and a manner that reads, under congressional fire, as carefully controlled, sits at a table facing a committee of approximately 50 representatives. Behind him, the gallery is packed. Outside, TikTok has organized a presence of creators and fans. The stakes for the company could not be higher. The hearing is, functionally, a public argument over whether TikTok should be allowed to continue operating in the United States. What follows is 5 hours of testimony that produces more heat than light, and not primarily because of anything Chu says or doesn't say. The committee members range from sharply informed to genuinely confused about the technology they're regulating. Several ask questions that conflate Wi-Fi with TikTok's data collection mechanisms. One representative appears to ask whether TikTok can access home Wi-Fi networks to monitor all internet traffic on a household router, a question that reflects either significant confusion about how apps work or a deliberate attempt to make TikTok seem more invasive than it is. Representative Richard Hudson's staff apparently prepped him with questions that would work better against a different type of technology than a mobile application. Representative Kat Kamak is sharper. She asks specifically about the ByteDance relationship, the access controls that exist between Chinese engineers and American user data, and the legal framework created by the National Intelligence Law. Her questions get closer to the actual concerns than most. Chu handles the hearing with a level of composure that observers from all perspectives acknowledge. He is consistent. He is careful. He returns again and again to Project Texas, the Oracle server arrangement, the USDS, or US Data Security Structure, that TikTok has built to create separation between American operations and Chinese oversight. He emphasizes that no evidence has been produced of actual Chinese government access to TikTok user data. He points out that TikTok's data collection practices are broadly similar to those of American platforms like Facebook and Instagram. This last point is the one that generates the most complex reaction, because it is true. TikTok collects data in ways that are, in their broad categories, similar to what Meta, Google, and other American platforms collect. The argument that TikTok is uniquely dangerous for its data collection practices, absent the Chinese government access concern, does not survive comparison with what American platforms do routinely. If the concern were simply data collection, the regulatory response should apply to the entire industry, not just the Chinese entrant. But the Chinese government access concern is not about the type of data collected. It's about who can access it. And no amount of Project Texas reassurance from Chu could give the committee confidence about a threat model that requires trusting assurances from a company whose parent is legally subject to Chinese state authority. The hearing ends without resolution. Congress has not established a clear factual record of Chinese government access. TikTok has not provided the kind of independent, verifiable technical assurance that would satisfy the security community's concerns. And the 5 hours of testimony have generated extensive media coverage that moves public opinion in multiple directions simultaneously. Some viewers conclude that TikTok is clearly a threat. Others conclude that Congress is clueless about technology and xenophobically targeting a Chinese company. And a significant percentage of younger viewers who watch the clips on TikTok find the whole thing somewhat absurd. Outside Washington, governments around the world were not waiting for the hearing to resolve anything. They were already moving. India moved first. On June 29, 2020, the Indian government banned TikTok, along with 58 other Chinese apps, citing national security and data privacy concerns. The ban was immediate and total. TikTok was removed from Indian app stores overnight. At the time of the ban, India had approximately 200 million TikTok users, making it the platform's largest market outside China. The Indian decision was made in the context of a border conflict with China in the Galwan Valley, a military standoff that had resulted in casualties on both sides. And the banning of Chinese tech platforms was as much a geopolitical signal as a security measure. The Indian ban was TikTok's first major government-imposed shutdown. It was not its last. Pakistan banned TikTok 4 times between 2020 and 2022. each time citing content moderation failures, specifically the platform's apparent inability to prevent the spread of content the Pakistani government considered immoral or blasphemous. The bans were each lifted after TikTok made commitments about content moderation, and then reimposed when the government determined those commitments hadn't been met. The cycle illustrated a different dimension of the TikTok regulatory problem. Not just the national security data concern, but the content governance challenge of a platform whose algorithm surfaces content so effectively that keeping certain types of content from reaching users requires either technological solutions that don't yet exist or human content moderation at a scale that is economically prohibitive. The United States federal government banned TikTok from government devices in December 2022 through legislation signed by President Biden. The ban applied to all federal executive branch devices, the phones and laptops of federal employees, on the basis that TikTok presented an unacceptable security risk on devices that handled government communications. Over 30 states enacted similar bans on government devices. The European Union's Data Protection Authority began investigations. The European Parliament, the European Commission, and the Council of the EU all banned TikTok from official devices in early 2023. The UK government followed. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, each of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance nations took actions limiting or banning TikTok on government devices, each citing essentially the same national security framework. Afghanistan, under Taliban rule, banned TikTok in 2022 for leading youth astray, a motivation entirely different from the Western security concerns, but which illustrated the global breadth of governments finding reasons to restrict the platform. What is striking about the ban wave is its geographic spread and the consistency of the underlying concern across governments with very different political systems and very different relationships with China. The Five Eyes governments, whose intelligence sharing arrangement is one of the most sophisticated in the world, were moving in coordination, reflecting a shared analytical picture that had been developed through classified channels. The specific framing differed by country, reflecting each government's domestic political context, but the core concern was the same. And then, in March 2024, the United States Congress did something it had been threatening to do for years. It passed a law. April 24th, 2024. President Biden signs the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act into law. The legislation gives ByteDance 270 days to divest TikTok's U.S. operations, to sell the American TikTok business to a non-Chinese owner, or face a ban. If no sale is completed within the 270-day period, TikTok will be prohibited from operating in the United States. The passage of the law was itself a story. The bill had been introduced, debated, failed, reintroduced, and ultimately attached to a broader foreign aid package that included military assistance for Ukraine and Israel, a legislative vehicle that made it politically easier to support without it appearing to be solely an anti-China measure. It passed the Senate 79-18. The margin was not close. TikTok's legal response was immediate. The company filed suit in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals within days of the law's signing, arguing that the forced divestiture law was unconstitutional, a violation of the First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech. The argument was sophisticated. TikTok is a platform that distributes speech. Forcing it to either sell or shut down is a government-imposed restriction on speech, and restrictions on speech require a level of justification, what the law calls strict scrutiny, that the government must meet by demonstrating a compelling interest and showing that the law is narrowly tailored to address it. The government's counterargument was equally sophisticated. The law doesn't restrict speech based on content, it restricts a specific corporate structure, Chinese ownership of an American communications platform, on national security grounds. The national security interest in preventing a foreign adversary government from potentially accessing American users' data or influencing the content Americans see is a compelling interest, and divestiture is narrowly tailored because it preserves the platform while removing the problematic ownership structure. The D.C. Circuit Court ruled against TikTok in December 2024, upholding the law. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case on an expedited basis, recognizing the time sensitivity of the 270-day clock. In January 2025, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the divestiture law, a 9-0 decision that held the national security justification sufficient to survive First Amendment scrutiny. The night before the law technically took effect, January 18, 2025, TikTok went dark in the United States. Users who opened the app saw a message stating that the app was unavailable due to a law banning TikTok. It was the first time in American history that a social media platform used by over 170 million Americans had been shut down by government action. It lasted less than 14 hours. President-elect Donald Trump, who had himself attempted to ban TikTok during his first term before reversing course, publicly stated that he wanted to find a solution that would keep TikTok available. ByteDance, calculating that the new administration's political signaling created room for negotiation, restored service. Trump issued an executive order on his first day in office directing the Justice Department not to enforce the divestiture law for 75 days, providing time for a potential deal. What followed was a negotiation of extraordinary complexity, involving potential American buyers, the Chinese government's role in approving any sale of the algorithm, the valuation of TikTok's US operations, and the political calculations of multiple governments simultaneously. The algorithm, the core of TikTok's value, was subject to Chinese export control restrictions, meaning that a sale of TikTok without the algorithm would produce a shell of a company, and a sale that included the algorithm required Chinese government approval that Beijing showed no particular enthusiasm for providing. The impasse was not accidental, it was structural, and it illuminated something about the TikTok dispute that the simpler national security framing had been obscuring. Here's the dimension of the TikTok debate that gets less attention than the data sovereignty question, and which some analysts argue is actually more important. The data concern is about what TikTok takes. The content concern is about what TikTok shows. In October 2023, a nonprofit research organization called the Network Contagion Research Institute published a study that examined TikTok's content distribution patterns on politically sensitive topics. The study compared how TikTok and Instagram distributed content related to the Israel-Gaza conflict, the Uyghur situation in Xinjiang, Taiwan, Tiananmen Square, and other topics that are sensitive within China's domestic political framework. The findings were striking. On topics sensitive to China, Uyghur repression, Tiananmen Square, Taiwan independence, TikTok surfaced dramatically less content than Instagram. On topics not sensitive to China, the Israel-Gaza conflict, for example, TikTok's distribution was comparable to or more extensive than Instagram's. The pattern suggested to the researchers that TikTok's content distribution was not algorithmically neutral, but reflected systematic suppression of topics that Beijing found inconvenient. TikTok disputed the methodology and the conclusions. The company pointed out that content about Uyghurs, Tiananmen, and Taiwan exists on TikTok and is accessible, and that the study's comparison methodology was flawed. Independent academics who reviewed the study had mixed assessments of its rigor. But the underlying question, can TikTok's algorithm be used to shape public opinion in ways that serve Chinese strategic interests, is not one that a single study can answer definitively. It is a question that requires access to the algorithm itself, to the training data that shaped it, and to the content distribution patterns at a level of granularity that TikTok has not made available to independent researchers. What we know from the historical record is this. Douyin, TikTok's Chinese sibling app, operates in China under content restrictions that are explicitly political. Content about Tiananmen doesn't appear. Content questioning CCP governance doesn't appear. Content about Taiwan that contradicts the mainland position doesn't appear. The algorithm that operates on Douyin has been trained to produce those outcomes in the context of Chinese domestic political requirements. The question is whether a version of those training priorities has been carried over, in whole or in part, into the global TikTok algorithm. This is not a paranoid conspiracy theory. It is a legitimate engineering question about the relationship between an app trained and developed in an environment with specific political content requirements and its international deployment. A former ByteDance engineer who spoke to journalists under conditions of anonymity described the company's content moderation approach in terms that suggested the boundaries between Chinese and international content policy were not as clean as TikTok's public statements implied. Specific topics, including some Tibet and Taiwan content, were flagged in ways that reduced their distribution, even on the international platform, according to this account. TikTok denied these characterizations. The company pointed to the volume of content on its platform that is critical of China, including content about Uyghur repression that reaches large audiences. It noted that its content moderation decisions are publicly available in transparency reports. The problem with adjudicating this dispute from outside the algorithm is fundamental. You cannot verify the absence of bias by looking at what surfaces. You need to look at what doesn't surface. And the content that gets quietly suppressed is, by definition, the content you don't see. This is what makes the algorithm concern different from a simple propaganda concern. Propaganda is visible. Selective suppression is not. Let's step back from the specific mechanics of TikTok's data collection and algorithm and look at the larger strategic picture. Because the TikTok dispute is not really about TikTok. It is the most visible current battle in a much larger war over who controls the digital infrastructure of the 21st century. The internet, as it was originally conceived and as it developed through its first 3 decades, was built primarily by American companies on American technical standards using American investment capital, subject to American legal frameworks. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, the dominant platforms of the global internet are American. Their servers are largely in American jurisdiction. Their legal obligations are to American courts. The data of the world's internet users flows in enormous quantities through infrastructure owned and operated by companies that are subject to American law. This is not a neutral arrangement. From the perspective of non-American governments, including the Chinese government, but also European governments, emerging market governments, and everyone else, the open internet has always been, in practice, an American-controlled internet. The US government's ability to compel American tech companies to provide data through legal process, to install surveillance backdoors, to restrict services to adversary countries, these capabilities have been documented post-Snowden in ways that make the American concern about Chinese access to TikTok data feel to some observers like a degree of hypocrisy. China drew the conclusion from the Snowden revelations that the only way to protect Chinese data and Chinese citizens from American surveillance was to build a separate internet, the Great Firewall that keeps American platforms out of China, the domestic alternatives that route Chinese digital traffic through Chinese-controlled infrastructure, the data sovereignty laws that require data about Chinese citizens to be stored on Chinese servers. The strategy has significant economic costs. Chinese internet users don't have access to Google or YouTube or Instagram, but it achieves the strategic objective of keeping Chinese data out of American hands. What TikTok represents, from the Chinese government's perspective, is the inverse of that equation, a Chinese platform operating in American digital space, potentially providing access to American user data. Whether the Chinese government actively exploits that access is less important than the existence of the capability. Its existence changes the strategic balance. The American response to TikTok, the forced divestiture law, the device bans, the congressional hearings, is not purely driven by genuine national security analysis. It is also driven by geopolitical competition, by lobbying from American tech companies that have been excluded from the Chinese market and have a commercial interest in Chinese platforms being excluded from the American one, by political calculations about appearing tough on China, and by genuine bipartisan anxiety about Beijing's growing technological capabilities. These motivations exist simultaneously and are difficult to disentangle. The national security concern is real. The competitive and political motivations are also real. The presence of the less noble motivations does not invalidate the security concern. The security concern does not excuse the less noble motivations. All of it is true at once, which is why the TikTok story resists the simple framing that its loudest advocates on either side prefer. What is not ambiguous is the larger stakes. The question of whether a Chinese-owned platform can operate freely in Western democratic markets and whether Western-owned platforms can operate freely in Chinese markets is a question about the architecture of the global digital economy for the next 50 years. TikTok is the test case. The precedent set in its resolution will shape every subsequent decision about cross-border data flows, platform ownership, and the relationship between technology companies and the national security concerns of the states they operate in. And then there is the users, the 1.5 billion people who scroll every day, who create on it, who build businesses on it, who found communities there. Their interests sit somewhere in this geopolitical calculation, and they don't always find themselves well represented. Let's talk about the people who don't appear in congressional hearings or intelligence briefings. The ones who woke up on January 19th, 2025, opened TikTok, and found it dark. There are approximately 170 million TikTok users in the United States. Among them, roughly 7 million people describe themselves as professional or semi-professional creators, people for whom TikTok is a primary or significant income source. Small business owners who use TikTok Shop to sell products, musicians who built audiences that led to record deals, chefs whose recipe videos produced cookbook deals and restaurant partnerships, fitness trainers who built subscription businesses, comedians who found their audience before any other platform knew they existed, mental health professionals who reached people who would never have gone looking for mental health content on their own. These are real economic relationships, built over real time, representing real livelihoods. The argument that creators can just move to Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts is technically accurate and experientially obtuse. The audiences built on TikTok are not perfectly portable. The algorithmic discovery that TikTok uniquely excels at, the ability of a creator with no existing audience to reach millions through the For You page, is not replicated at the same level on competing platforms. Many small creators who built businesses on TikTok would not have built equivalent businesses on Meta or Google, whose algorithms favor established accounts with existing follower bases. The communities that formed on TikTok are also not simply replicable. Communities of disabled users who found each other through shared content, LGBTQ+ youth in conservative regions who found connection and support through an algorithm that matched them with relevant content before they knew how to search for it. Immigrant communities who found cultural continuity in a For You page that surfaced content in their home languages and traditions. These are not trivial things, and they are not easily relocated. The creator's political response to the divestiture threat was itself a TikTok story. Millions of users posted videos about the potential ban. Creators flew to Washington to lobby their representatives. The argument they made was not about ByteDance or Chinese data security. It was about the direct economic and social harm of removing a platform that had become integral to their lives and livelihoods. This argument was politically effective in ways that surprised some observers. The bipartisan support for the divestiture law was not matched by bipartisan hostility to TikTok among the general public. Polls consistently showed that a majority of Americans, particularly younger Americans, opposed a ban. The disconnect between elite opinion, security professionals, intelligence officials, members of Congress, and popular opinion, millions of users who experience TikTok as a creative and economic platform, is one of the defining tensions of the story. The security concern is real. The platform value is also real. The people making the security decision are almost by definition not the people who would bear the cost of it. This is a recurring pattern in technology policy. The experts who understand the risk and the users who bear the consequences of the response are different populations with different information and different stakes. Getting the balance right requires the kind of democratic deliberation that the speed of the TikTok situation, the 270-day clock, the Supreme Court challenge, the presidential executive orders, did not easily accommodate. The creators made their videos. The algorithm served them. Somewhere in Beijing, ByteDance watched the engagement metrics and tried to figure out its next move. As of the making of this video, TikTok's fate in the United States remains unresolved in the most consequential sense. The Supreme Court has upheld the divestiture law. The Trump administration has provided temporary relief from enforcement while negotiating a potential deal. ByteDance has not divested. The Chinese government has not approved any sale that would include the algorithm. The range of possible outcomes is wide. A negotiated sale to an American buyer, with or without the algorithm, remains theoretically possible, but practically complicated by the valuation gap and the Chinese government's control over whether the algorithm can be exported. A long-term extension of the enforcement pause, under negotiated conditions about data access and content governance, is possible, but would require Congress to accept something it has already voted to prohibit. A full enforcement of the ban, with TikTok disappearing from American app stores and American servers, remains legally available and would be triggered by a presidential decision. The outcome in America will shape the global conversation about TikTok and about Chinese tech platforms more broadly, in ways that are difficult to overstate. If the United States effectively bans TikTok, it provides cover for other governments in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, to take similar actions without facing the accusation that they are following American geopolitical leadership. If the United States reaches a negotiated accommodation with ByteDance, it signals that the security concerns were manageable and that the relationship between Chinese technology companies and Western markets is not zero-sum. China is watching both possibilities carefully. The TikTok case is being processed in Beijing not primarily as a business dispute, but as a test of how the United States and its allies intend to treat Chinese technology companies in the global market. The outcome will influence Chinese decisions about reciprocal treatment of American technology companies, which, it should be noted, are not currently permitted to operate freely in China anyway. The asymmetry of the existing situation, American platforms excluded from China, Chinese platforms operating in America under threat of ban, is something that both sides use to support completely different arguments about who is behaving badly. The deeper question that the TikTok story forces into view is one that every government and every society with a significant digital economy will need to answer. What is the acceptable relationship between a technology platform and the sovereignty of the state? Who owns the data that 1 billion people generate daily? Who has the right to regulate the algorithms that shape what 1 billion people see, think, and believe? What are the limits of national security as a justification for restricting speech, commerce, and connection? These questions did not begin with TikTok. The Snowden revelations raised them from a different angle. The Cambridge Analytica scandal raised them in the context of American platforms. The EU's GDPR raised them in the regulatory sphere. But TikTok has concentrated them into a specific, vivid, politically contentious case study that has forced governments to articulate positions they had previously been able to avoid. The answers they arrive at will define the architecture of the digital world for decades. Here is the honest summary of what we know and don't know. We know that ByteDance, as a Chinese company, is subject to Chinese law, including the National Intelligence Law. We know that Chinese engineers had access to American TikTok user data, at least until Project Texas was implemented. We know that TikTok's algorithm is a black box whose training priorities are not independently verifiable. We know that the app collects extensive behavioral data from its users. We know that governments from Washington to Delhi have determined that this combination of facts is unacceptable from a national security perspective. We do not know whether the Chinese government has ever used TikTok to access American user data. We do not know whether the algorithm has ever been used to systematically suppress content unfavorable to Beijing in Western markets. We do not know whether Project Texas has actually created the separation between American operations and Chinese oversight that TikTok claims it has. These things have not been established by any public, independent, technically credible investigation with access to the relevant systems and data. The absence of proof is not the same as proof of absence. That is the position of the security establishment, and it is formally correct. You cannot prove a negative. The inability to demonstrate that Chinese access has occurred does not mean it hasn't. Infrastructure vulnerabilities exist before they are exploited. But governing by the principle that any capability must be assumed to be exercised produces its own problems. By that standard, every American technology company that operates globally could be treated as a potential instrument of American surveillance because it could be compelled to cooperate with American intelligence. The principle is not uniquely Chinese. It is the principle of all state power over private entities. What differs is the framework of legal accountability and judicial oversight that each state provides. And that difference, the difference between a state that has checks on its power and a state that doesn't, is the real argument. Not that China is uniquely malevolent, but that a system without judicial checks on state power over private companies creates a structural vulnerability that no amount of corporate engineering can fully close. TikTok is still on your phone right now. The algorithm is still running. The For You page is still updating, still learning, still finding the exact content that will hold you for one more video, one more minute, one more scroll. Somewhere, the behavioral profile the app has built of you is sitting in a database that is, according to TikTok, on Oracle servers in Texas, protected by American law, inaccessible to Chinese engineers. That's what TikTok says. Whether you believe it, whether you think the risk is real, manageable, overstated, or weaponized for geopolitical purposes, is a judgment call that every user, every voter, and every government in every country where TikTok operates is making right now. The scroll never ends. The question it raises does. One app, 1.5 billion users, 2 superpowers. The future of who controls the digital world is being written in the policy documents and court rulings and executive orders that are landing right now while you're watching this. What side of history do you want to be on? If you enjoyed this episode and would like to watch more content like this, simply click the like and share button and subscribe to this channel to get notified when we post new content. See you on the next episode of the Dark Ledger series.